10:22 in the morning, June 4th, 1942, north of Midway Atoll. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers are steaming in formation, decks crowded with fueled, armed aircraft being readied for a second strike, when a handful of American dive bombers appeared directly overhead, completely unopposed, dropping out of broken cloud with no fighters left at altitude to stop them. Within about 6 minutes, 3 of those 4 carriers are burning wrecks. A Japanese pilot who survived the attack later described watching his own ship's flight deck erupt like a volcano. Nobody on those decks had seen the American aircraft coming until the bombs were already falling. Pause on that. The airplane that did most of that damage was not fast, not heavily armed, and not new. It was the Douglas SBD Dauntless, a slow, fixed landing gear scout bomber that crews themselves joked stood for slow but deadly, flown by pilots who had spent the previous 6 months of the Pacific War mostly losing.
This is not simply a story about a bomber sinking carriers. It is the story of how a single morning of near total American torpedo plane sacrifice, one commander's fuel-starved gamble on a hunch, and a Japanese ordnance decision made under impossible time pressure combined to hand 3 of Japan's finest carriers, and by nightfall a 4th, to a squadron of aircraft nobody considered glamorous. Part 1. The SBD Dauntless traced its design back to the mid-1930s, and by 1942 was already considered something close to obsolete by the standards of a war that was rapidly moving toward faster, more heavily armed aircraft on both sides. It carried a pilot and a rear gunner in tandem, a pair of forward-firing machine guns and a flexible twin-mount gun facing aft, and a bomb load that typically topped out around 1,000 pounds under the fuselage, with smaller bombs under each wing. Its one genuinely modern feature was a set of perforated split flaps that opened both above and below the wing during a dive, letting the aircraft plunge toward a target at a steep angle, often close to 70 degrees, while staying controllable enough for the pilot to actually aim. That combination, a stable dive platform paired with a skilled bombardier pilot, made the Dauntless a far more accurate weapon against a moving ship than level bombing from altitude had ever managed to be. By 1942, the Navy had also refined its dive bombing doctrine around the aircraft's specific strengths. Pilots were trained to approach at altitude, roll into a near vertical dive directly over the target, and release at a few thousand feet before pulling out low over the water, a technique that traded exposure time to enemy fire for a dramatic improvement in hit percentage compared to torpedo attacks or level bombing runs, both of which required aircraft to fly slow, level, and predictable for an extended final approach directly into a ship's anti-aircraft guns. Part 2. The road to Midway began not over the Pacific, but inside a windowless basement at Pearl Harbor, where Navy cryptanalysts working under Commander Joseph Rochefort had spent months chipping away at the Japanese Navy's JN-25 code. By May 1942, they had enough of it broken to intercept references to an impending operation against a target designated only by the letters AF. Rochefort's team confirmed the target was Midway by having the atoll's garrison send a fake, uncoded message reporting a freshwater plant failure, then watching Japanese radio traffic repeat the same detail using the designator AF within days. Armed with that confirmation, Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and a hastily patched-up Yorktown, still smoking from damage suffered weeks earlier at the Coral Sea, in ambush north of the atoll, waiting for a Japanese fleet that believed it was steaming toward an unsuspecting target. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's plan for the operation was, on paper, formidable. A diversionary strike against the Aleutian Islands meant to split American attention. A powerful battleship force trailing behind the carriers, and an invasion convoy prepared to occupy Midway once its airfield had been neutralized. All built around the assumption that the American carrier fleet, still believed by Japanese intelligence to include only 2 operational flat tops after Coral Sea, would either not respond in time or would be destroyed piecemeal once it did. The plan's central vulnerability, that American codebreakers already knew almost exactly where and when the attack was coming, undid nearly every advantage Yamamoto believed he still held before the first Japanese aircraft ever left its carrier deck. Part 3. The morning of June 4th did not open well for the American side. Torpedo squadrons from all three carriers, flying aging, slow TBD Devastators, located the Japanese carrier force first and attacked without fighter escort or dive bomber support arriving alongside them, largely because the American strike groups had become badly separated during launch and navigation. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet found the Japanese fleet alone and pressed its attack regardless, and every one of its 15 aircraft was shot down, its crews killed to the last man except for a single survivor, Ensign George Gay, who watched the rest of the battle from the water beneath his life raft. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown fared little better, suffering catastrophic losses of their own with almost nothing to show for it in terms of hits. It would have been reasonable, watching only that hour of the battle unfold, to conclude the American attack had already failed. The scale of the loss is worth sitting with directly. Of the roughly 41 American torpedo bombers launched against the Japanese fleet that morning, all but a handful were shot down, and only a single torpedo is generally believed to have even reached a target without exploding. Measured purely by its own objective, sinking ships with torpedoes, the attack was close to a total failure, and for decades afterward, veterans of the torpedo squadrons and their families had reason to wonder whether their sacrifice had accomplished anything at all beyond the deaths of nearly 90 aircrew in a single morning. Part 4. What that sacrifice did, whether anyone intended it or not, was pull the Japanese Combat Air Patrol's Zero fighters down to wave-top height, chasing the surviving torpedo bombers, stripping away fighter cover at altitude at the exact moment it would matter most. Above them, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, leading Enterprise's dive bomber group, had already spent close to 2 hours searching empty ocean for a Japanese fleet that was not where its expected position had suggested it would be, burning fuel his aircraft could not spare, and facing a real possibility of having to abort and search for his own carrier instead. Rather than turn back, McCluskey elected to continue the search along a hunch and spotted the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, racing to rejoin the fleet after depth charging an American submarine. McCluskey followed that single ship's wake directly to the Japanese carrier force, arriving overhead at almost the exact moment the enemy flight decks were most vulnerable, and with no Zeros left at altitude to intercept him. It is worth noting that McCluskey's decision was, by the standards of naval aviation at the time, a genuine gamble rather than an obviously correct call made with confidence. Several of his aircraft were low enough on fuel that they would not have enough remaining to return to Enterprise even after the attack, and at least a few Dauntlesses from his group ultimately ran dry and ditched in the ocean on the way back, their crews recovered later by American destroyers. Nimitz himself is reported to have later credited McCluskey's search with saving the entire Pacific Fleet's carrier force, a judgment that reflects just how differently the battle could have unfolded had McCluskey turned for home 10 minutes earlier. Part 5. What followed has been called, not entirely accurately as it turns out, the 6 most decisive minutes of the Pacific War. McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers split their attack between Kaga and Akagi, while Yorktown's dive bomber squadron, under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, arriving independently and almost simultaneously by pure coincidence of timing rather than any coordinated plan, hit Soryu at nearly the same moment. Kaga took 4 direct hits and was left a burning ruin. Akagi absorbed what most accounts describe as 2 or 3 bombs, one landing squarely amid parked aircraft on the hangar deck, and the fires that resulted proved impossible to control. Soryu, struck by 3 bombs from Leslie's squadron, was ablaze within minutes, and would later also take a torpedo from the American submarine Nautilus as it lay dead in the water. All 3 ships would sink or be scuttled by the following morning. Survivor accounts from the Japanese side describe the speed of the disaster in almost disbelieving terms. Crewmen below decks on Kaga and Akagi had, minutes earlier, been celebrating what they believed was a successful morning strike against Midway's airfield, and preparing aircraft for a follow-up attack meant to finish off the American fleet once it was located. Several accounts describe pilots and mechanics on the hangar decks having no warning at all before bombs began exploding around them. One Japanese officer who survived Akagi's sinking later wrote that the ship went, in the span of a single strike, from the pride of the combined fleet to a drifting hulk that its own crew was ordered to abandon. Part 6. The reason those fires spread so catastrophically fast has long been explained by a single dramatic detail. That Japanese commander Chuichi Nagumo, having launched his first strike against Midway itself, was in the middle of rearming his reserve aircraft for a second land attack mission when American carriers were unexpectedly sighted, forcing a hurried, unfinished switch back to torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for a naval target, leaving decks and hangars littered with fuel hoses, ordnance carts, and armed, fueled aircraft at the exact moment the American dive bombers arrived. That version of events comes largely from a post-war account by Japanese air officer Mitsuo Fuchida, and it has shaped popular retellings of Midway for decades. It is worth being honest here. Subsequent research by historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully, working from surviving Japanese ship deck logs and action reports rather than post-war memoir, has argued Fuchida's account overstated how fully spotted the Japanese decks actually were at the moment of attack, and that the ordnance switch chaos, while real, was probably a smaller factor in the disaster than the original story suggests, compared to the sheer number and placement of bomb hits themselves. The broad outcome, 3 carriers destroyed in minutes, is not in dispute. The precise mechanism behind exactly how fast and how completely those decks caught fire is one of the areas of Midway's history where the popular account and the more recent archival research do not fully agree. What is not in dispute, regardless of which version of the ordnance switch story is more accurate, is that the sheer density of aircraft, fuel lines, and ordnance already present on any fleet carrier's hangar deck during flight operations made a bomb hit catastrophically dangerous under almost any circumstances, spotted for a second strike or not, and that Japanese damage control doctrine and equipment in 1942 were considerably less developed than the systems the U.S. Navy would field later in the war, a gap that made recovering from even a handful of direct hits far harder for Japanese crews than it might otherwise have been. Part 7. The 4th Japanese carrier, Hiryu, was not present in that 6-minute strike at all, and had spent the morning undamaged. Within hours, it launched 2 retaliatory strikes of its own against USS Yorktown, the first of dive bombers that left Yorktown dead in the water and burning, the second of torpedo planes that struck home hard enough that her crew eventually abandoned ship, though the carrier would remain afloat, under tow, for 2 more days before a Japanese submarine finished her off. It was not until the afternoon, hours after the morning's attack on the other 3 carriers, that American search aircraft finally located Hiryu, and a fresh strike, drawn in part from Enterprise's air group, and including at least one pilot, Lieutenant Richard Best, who had also personally hit Akagi that same morning, found and set her ablaze as well. Hiryu was scuttled by her own escorts in the early hours of June 5th. The popular shorthand that America sank 4 carriers in one morning compresses a genuinely 2-part battle, 3 carriers destroyed before midday, and a 4th found and destroyed that afternoon, into a single dramatic image that is close to the truth, but not quite exact. And the distinction matters if you want to understand how the battle actually unfolded, rather than just how it is usually remembered. Yorktown's own fate deserves its own honest accounting, rather than a footnote. Already damaged from Coral Sea, and patched together in an extraordinary 72-hour repair effort at Pearl Harbor that dockyard workers themselves considered close to impossible, she absorbed Hiryu's 2 strikes, was abandoned once, partially reboarded by a skeleton salvage crew, and was finally lost on June 7th, not to Hiryu's aircraft at all, but to a Japanese submarine, I-168, which found her under tow and put 2 torpedoes into her, along with the destroyer USS Hammond standing alongside. Yorktown's loss is a reminder that Midway was not a clean, one-sided American victory delivered without cost. It was the single most expensive carrier battle of the Pacific War for the United States as well, judged purely by ships lost, even as it proved catastrophic for Japan in ships that could not be replaced nearly as quickly. Part 8. It would be a mistake to read Midway as proof that the Dauntless was simply a superior weapon that inevitably would have won this fight under any circumstances. The honest version credits several things happening together. Cryptanalysts breaking a code months in advance, a squadron of torpedo bomber crews who attacked knowing full well they had little chance of surviving, and who, by dying, stripped away the fighter cover that would otherwise have shredded the dive bombers that followed, and one commander's decision to keep burning fuel on a hunch rather than turn for home. Take away any single one of those elements, the broken code, the torpedo squadron sacrifice, or McCluskey's gamble, and there is no clear reason to believe the Dauntless crews would have found an intact Japanese fleet with an open sky above it at all. Richard Best's feat, hitting two separate fleet carriers on the same day, remains one of the individually most remarkable performances by any pilot of the Pacific War. And it happened only because of everything that had already gone right, and gone catastrophically wrong, for the men who flew before him earlier that same morning. It is also worth being precise about what understanding actually failed on the Japanese side, since that failure is really the heart of this story, rather than any single mechanical flaw in Japanese ship design or fighter doctrine. Japanese carrier doctrine in 1942 assumed that a well-handled fleet, screened by capable fighters and warned by picket ships and scout planes, would have time to either intercept an incoming strike, or at minimum, clear its decks before bombs began falling. Nagumo's scouting that morning had been thin. A single delayed search plane from the cruiser Tone very nearly missed the American carriers entirely, and by the time reliable contact reports reached his flagship, the window to prepare had already narrowed to minutes, rather than the hour or more Japanese doctrine assumed a well-run search would provide. The Dauntless crews did not need a technical explanation for how they won. What genuinely confused Japanese survivors afterward, by their own post-war accounts, was less the airplane itself than how quickly an apparently secure formation, screened by dozens of fighters and cruisers, had gone from routine flight operations to catastrophic loss with almost no warning in between. The victory came at a cost to the men who won it as well. Best himself flew his last combat mission that day. A cracked oxygen canister in his aircraft had been leaking caustic chemical into his breathing supply during both of his June 4th flights, damage to his lungs serious enough that he was grounded for the rest of the war within weeks of the battle that made him famous. Many of the Dauntless aircrew who survived Midway went on to fly through the rest of 1942's brutal carrier battles in the Solomon Islands, at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz, in the same aircraft type, now recognized as anything but obsolete. The Japanese Navy, for its part, lost not just 4 fleet carriers, but a disproportionate share of its most experienced maintenance crews and deck personnel, a loss of institutional skill from which its carrier force never fully recovered for the remainder of the war. Historians have generally treated Midway as the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment the strategic initiative shifted from Japan to the United States, less than 6 months after Pearl Harbor. Though it is worth noting that the harder, longer campaigns still to come, at Guadalcanal, in the Solomons, and across the long island-hopping advance toward Japan itself, would still take almost 3 more years of grinding combat to complete. Midway did not end the war. It ended, in the space of 1 morning and 1 afternoon, Japan's ability to plan future operations around the assumption that its carrier force could not be seriously challenged. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because there are more of these, more battles decided as much by sacrifice, luck, and a single officer's stubborn hunch as by any airplane specifications, and more crews who flew obsolete-looking machines into the exact 6 minutes of history that needed them. The Dauntless did not win Midway by itself. It arrived at the one moment the sky above 4 Japanese carriers had been emptied by other men's deaths, and it did not miss.